In modules 9 and 10, we read Timothy Morton's book, Humankind, Solidarity with Non-Human People. Morton is the chair of the English department at Rice University. Before that, he was at UC Davis. And I think he really entered the center of ecological philosophy when he published his book Ecology Without Nature back in 2007. Since then, he's published a number of titles. Humankind was his most recent when I was planning this course late last year, but he's already got another book out called Being Ecological. So he's prolific, and I hope you enjoyed his book. He's a very playful writer, and I think it's pretty clear that his main goal in this book is basically to ecologize Marx, to take Marx outside of the anthropocentric context within which his ideas were conceived. And this is a huge project. It's actually much bigger than just tinkering with Marxist theory, since it also requires reimagining a mode of existence that has shaped human beings for nearly 10,000 years, according to Morton. That is, since the agricultural revolution. So while this is undoubtedly a huge task, Morton wants to make the case that solidarity is actually available on the cheap. And not just solidarity for humans, since in Morton's view, solidarity is actually the underlying phenomenology of what he calls the symbiotic real. And the symbiotic real is sort of this, he refers to it as this energy field of connectivity that is aesthetic and affective in nature. Morton writes on page 13 that solidarity cuts against the dominant ontological trend, default since the basic social, psychic, and philosophical foreclosure of the human-non-human symbiotic real that we call the Neolithic. So the Neolithic was the birth of agriculture when we left the Paleolithic. So Morton then goes on to define economics as the way that life forms organize their enjoyment. Both capitalism and communism, in Morton's view, have been anti-ecological political economies. He says that green is neither left nor right. But Morton does think that communism or Marxism holds more potential than capitalism for including non-humans, because communist theory, he says, is not snagged on ideas of property that make it impossible to imagine humans as just one life form among many. Capitalism, according to Morton, reduces both humans and non-humans to nothing more than lumps of extensional movement, and attempts to green capitalism amount to making this movement of lumps of extension more efficient. Anthropocentrism, then, is intrinsic to capitalism. It's a feature of capitalism. But Morton thinks that for Marx, anthropocentrism is a bug and not a feature. The bug in Marxism is also the bug in all post-Kantian thought, as Morton conceives of it. And here he's part of a movement in contemporary philosophy called object-oriented philosophy. And if you watch the short video clip where Sam Mickey describes it, I hope you'll have some sense for the background that Morton is drawing upon when he makes some of his arguments. So the bug in all post-Kantian thought is related to what Morton refers to, following a speculative realist thinker named Quentin Meillassoux. It's what's called correlationism. So the deeper structure of the anthropocentric bug in Marxism is this basically Kantian correlationism. So thinking beyond this deeply ingrained correlationist structure is threatening to the whole modern Western project. But the speculative realist movement, the object-oriented movement, may be, according to Morton, a symptom of incipient planetary awareness. So what is correlationism then? It's the idea that things are not strictly real until they are accessed by human consciousness. So for Kant, this comes through in his idea of an I think, or a cogito, or a transcendental ego that accompanies every conscious thought, feeling, or action that we take. So in Morton's terms, this subject tends to be found hovering invisibly behind the heads of only one entity in the actually existing universe, namely the human being. So Kant doesn't deny that there are things in themselves apart from human subjects, a mind-independent world, in other words, but he does argue that our knowledge of the world is rooted in how things appear to us through the filter of our own sensory and cognitive apparatus. The only reality we could ever know then is the one constructed for us by this apparatus. So reality is constructed by the subject. Humans, in this Kantian picture of the world, this correlationist picture, are thus locked in a sort of video game, as though a screen stands between us and reality, preventing us from ever making contact with its non-human contours. Even natural science is limited to describing nature as it appears on this screen. Science is thus merely a description of how nature appears to us. It's phenomenological, in other words. Science can come to understand the rules that determine how appearances arise in the video game, how the appearances are rendered, but it cannot say what is hidden behind the screen. This is why Morton reminds us that, and I quote, global warming scientists are constrained to broadcasting a percentage concerning the likelihood that humans caused it. So science can study nature with great precision without having to make metaphysical claims, but it remains limited by its data about things, by the way it accesses reality, and can't claim to provide us with knowledge of reality as it is in itself, independent of our modes of access. So Kant locates this correlationist gap between the human subject and everything else. Now Hegel, in the post-Kantian idealist thinker, was unhappy with this weaker form of correlationism. And so he took the radical step of relocating the gap between a thing and how it appears so that it was now internal to the human subject. At the beginning of chapter 2, called Specters in Humankind, Morton criticizes what he calls correlationism revelation mode. And he locates the origin of this tendency of thought in Kant, and he tracks its development through much of the philosophy and cultural expression that followed in Kant's wake. In Kant's case, as we've just heard, correlationism revelation mode is tied to what he called the transcendental ego, which Morton jokes is attached to the human like a balloon. And recall from Module 1's reading from William James's Principles of Psychology that James also uses an even more sarcastic balloon joke to take a jab at Kant's idealist inheritors. James says, "It was reserved for Kant's Fichtean and Hegelian successors to call the transcendental ego the first principle of philosophy, to spell its name with capital letters, and pronounce it with adoration, to act, in short, as if they were going up in a balloon whenever the notion of it crossed their mind." So to flesh out this analogy, Kant held the balloon in his hand wherever he went, but still he remained firmly planted on the ground, denying that we could ever have knowledge of the extra-subjective thing in itself, which he denoted as a mere X, while the philosophers who pushed his way of thinking further toward idealism by denying the thing in itself, or by allowing the transcendental ego or the subject to just swallow it up, ended up letting the balloon lift them off the ground high up into the air, where no objects remained at all. Morton points to New Age literature like Fritjof Capra's book, The Tao of Physics, and documentaries like What the Bleep Do We Know, as examples of this, the way that this stronger, more idealistic form of correlationism, revelation mode, has played out in the broader culture. And this correlationism revelation mode, it's basically the, what we tell ourselves, surprising and magical idea that, many of us, and I include myself in this tendency of thought, that many of us use to fend off crude materialistic reductionism. Namely, this correlationism revelation mode is the idea that, surprise, the object always entails the subject. And Morton is kind of bored by this supposed revelation. He sees it as, operating all around him, both among phenomenological philosophers and within New Age circles. And he's bored with it because he finds it to be insufferably anthropocentric. It's as if, for example, within quantum physics, correlationism revelation mode interprets quantum physics as though it's just human consciousness that collapses the wave function, as if nothing exists until a human ego becomes aware of it, except an indeterminate field of probability. So, he'll admit on page 52, he'll say, there is an element of empowerment against crude reductionist materialism operating in each case of correlationism revelation mode. But he says we seem not to be able to get enough of surprising ourselves with correlationism. It's like watching someone with hippocampus damage waking up again and again and again every 5 minutes in a loop, repeated over and over. It couldn't be more boringly conventional. One suspects that repetition is evidence of some unconscious aspect of what's going on. I'm out of the loop. I'm out of the loop. I'm out of the loop. And I don't know about you. I found this to be quite humorous. And, as I mentioned, I see this tendency in myself, in the way that I will be critical of the view from nowhere, and the way that I will point out to materialistic scientists who think that they've explained everything as though they're not situated, embodied organisms perceiving the world from a particular perspective with a certain cultural ideology and so on. It's a version of correlationism revelation mode to point out that we're always in the middle of things, that we can't escape our subjective perspective on the world. And, we might be a bit offended by Morton's joking dismissal or boredom, but with this idea. But he's really trying to get us to think outside of the correlationist box. So in Morton's Analogy, which he develops in Humankind, correlationism can be understood like two faders in a music studio mixing desk. A correlator fader and a correlatee fader. Hegel's strong correlationism turns the correlator fader all the way up and the correlatee fader all the way down. This extreme form of correlationism has shaped much leftist discourse in the 20th century, whether it's the phenomenological or continental philosophical discourse of the academy or the New Age discourse of popular culture. Academics are thus afraid of talking about the real nature of the correlatee hidden beneath its socially constructed correlated appearances, because turning up the correlatee fader like this is always to risk being called out as some form of violent essentialism, or that one is opposing violent essences upon the world and claiming that something is natural when in fact it's been socially constructed. Those who fight passionately for social, racial, gender justice tend to emphasize the power of the correlator right? Of the power of society to construct reality. While those who insist our problems would be solved by a return to nature tend to emphasize the importance of the correlatee. And, people on the right who emphasize genetic, racial identity and determinism, as well as deep ecologists in a different way, try to turn up the correlatee fader. So Morton's solution to this double bind, in other words, either everything is socially constructed by the human correlator or nothing is, Morton's solution is to release the anthropocentric copyright control on the gap and allow everything in the universe to have it. So whereas for Kant, this gap, this transcendental gap, was between the human and everything else, Morton's object-oriented ontology allows this gap to pervade the cosmos, such that there's a gap in all relations between things, between the appearance and the essence of a thing. So releasing this anthropocentric copyright control entails letting go of the idea that human thought is the top access mode, and instead allowing for an endless plurality of other valid access modes, whether they be sniffing, licking, brushing up against, really any way that two things, human or non, aesthetically relate to one another. Morton is here, as I've mentioned, drawing on object-oriented ontology, which was originated by the philosopher Graham Harman. This is precisely how Morton wants to reestablish an us, or a we, a sense of community, by showing that what we all have in common is precisely the gap between what we are in ourselves and how we appear to others. This gap is not established by humans alone, as Kant argued, but it is rather the basic access mode of all relations. Causality, then, is aesthetic because it is what binds us together in a symbiotic implosion of relations, an endless series of sensory screens becoming different together. This is what Whitehead called creativity, becoming different together. Humans can enter into solidarity with non-humans because we share this constitutive wound, this non-equivalence with ourselves. Our worlds are always breaking open into the worlds of others. So there are many worlds. There are a plurality of worlds. After the end of the world comes the beginning of many worlds. What we used to think of as our enclosed human consciousness constantly projecting upon the world is in fact quite leaky. And so Morton is a kind of panpsychist. And his panpsychism takes the form of what he calls a spectral ontology, or a spectral theory of the universe, of being, such that appearance in fact becomes a part of being, which goes against much of the history of philosophy back to Plato. Morton locates the historical origins of human alienation from the symbiotic real in the Neolithic Revolution, the birth of agriculture. And he refers to this dramatically as the severing. The birth of agriculture was the severing. It is a trauma that we continue to reenact thousands of years later. Because the trauma is so severe, it prevents us from looking directly at it, from remembering it in full consciousness. This historical and personal wounding occurs in the split of work or labor from play or dance. It is a rip between the human correlated world that exists within the walls of our cities and our consciousness and the ecological symbiosis constituting the actual biosphere of which our psyches, our bodies, our polis are a part. We never really left the symbiotic real, otherwise it wouldn't be real, but our anthropocentrism has trapped us within an alienated mode of consciousness. And this alienated mode has had really negative consequences for ourselves and for the biosphere. The severing has been reinforced by Kant's modern correlationist philosophy, which leads us into all sorts of confusions about how the human cultural world and the non-human natural world are related. And, Latour, of course, also thematized these confusions for us in his book Facing Gaia. If we are cultural theorists, we deny access to nature in itself by arguing that all knowledge claims about nature are really disguised social power, while if we are natural scientists, we reduce all cultural meaning to disguised biological forces, except, of course, science itself, which somehow transcends its cultural matrix to take a view from nowhere. So no matter which way modern and postmodern humans turn the correlator correlatee faders, the default understanding remains thoroughly anthropocentric. Correlationism also leads postmodern theorists to claim that human cultures are incommensurable, that there is no universal humanity, no universal language that could unite all human beings. Our cultural differences are too entrenched. And Morton parodies the irony of this view because despite an effort to avoid cultural appropriation at all costs, colonial power relations only end up being reinforced. With help from object-oriented ontology, he suggests instead that we can share worlds, not only with other humans, but with non-humans, because all of our worlds are perforated, permeable. Worlds are fragile. They're constantly bumping up against one another, and sometimes breaking into one another. No world is complete in and of itself. All worlds are broken. They leak into and out of one another. Morton thinks that difficulties of solidarity between humans are artifacts of repressing solidarity with non-humans, so that if we can learn to share worlds with non-humans, this should also help us heal our internal human-scale problems, like racism. Solidarity, according to Morton, is way easier than we traumatized post-agricultural, patriarchal, technological humans think it is. Morton writes, Western philosophy has been telling itself that human thought makes things real for so long that an ethics or politics based simply on allowing something real to impinge on us sounds absurd or impossible. Solidarity, a thought and a feeling and a physical and political state, seems in its pleasant confusion of feeling with and being with, appearing and being, phenomena and thing, active and passive, not simply to gesture to this non-severed real, but indeed to emerge from it. Solidarity is a deeply pleasant, stirring feeling and political state, and it is the cheapest and most readily available because it relies on the basic, default, symbiotic real. Since solidarity is so cheap and default, it extends to non-humans automatically. That's from page 19. So if correlationism is linked to Kant's transcendental philosophy, and the idea that human thought, and specifically mathematizable reason, is the top access mode, how do we escape it? I would argue, as I do in my dissertation, that descendental philosophy is this escape route. If causality is aesthetic, as Kant himself admits, in other words, causality unfolds within our spatio-temporal intuitions. It's not something that happens in the world independently of us. It is rather a feature of our own spatio-temporal experience, of the forms of our aesthetic intuition. If causality is aesthetic in this way, then undoing correlationism doesn't mean overcoming it. That would just be another Hegelian slinky game in Morton's terms, but rather just letting go and feeling it happen. The symbiotic real is cheap. It is happening all the time without consciousness needing to try to do anything, without the understanding or the mind, the intellect, needing to manufacture any conceptual determinations. It is buzzing incessantly just down and to the left of everything the transcendental general is always barking at us. Stop projecting, it's yelling. Obey the laws of logic. Think for yourself. Don't be a pushover, and so on. Agricultural religions tell us to worship what is up and to the right of all our anthropocentric correlating. For Kant, this meant fixing spatial and temporal forms of intuition to a Euclidean form of geometry and arithmetic. But it turns out that there are many true geometries, and that time is tough, if not impossible, to count and quantify. Instead of trying to ground phenomena in the causal determinism of a mathematized nature, as transcendental correlationism does, descendental philosophy, aesthetic ontology, in other words, ungrounds causality by housing it within our aesthetic relations to strange neighbors. Causality is sensual. It's rooted in feeling. The cosmic cave of space-time is, as we heard in Module 1 with Morton's help, it's a rave. Light and music. Sensation is not a screen reflecting our projections, or the introjection of the wholly other. It is a fuzzy, permeable membrane with no clear boundary separating inside and outside. Sensation is always in the middle of things, not exclusively on the side of the subject opposite things. Our economic relations to one another are not as isolated human individuals with self-interests, but as symbiotic creatures reciprocally captured within economies of expression and enjoyment. Our interests co-evolve in these reciprocally, intimately interwoven relationships. Economics, as Morton tells us, is just how life forms organize their enjoyment. And anthrodecentric economics will require a descendental panpsychism, delving below the rational mind to the affective environment within which it swims. There is no top access mode, since all access modes are somewhere in the middle. It's not that reason and rationality and science aren't valid access modes. It's that they have to stop trying to dominate all the other access modes and recognize their place amidst the others, unique and special in their own ways, but not the be-all and end-all, the one true way to access reality. Morton refers to his ontology to reality as containing a kind of ontological shimmering. So his aesthetic ontology makes appearance an intrinsic part of being. A thing, he says, is never simply present here and now. Things are a function of two abyssal movements. These two movements are an already actualized past appearance, which slides over an as yet unrealized future essence. He refers to this as a spectral ontology, as I've mentioned, since there is a wavering or a shimmering between appearance and essence. Spectral also refers to the way that it becomes impossible to distinguish between behaving and acting, between executing an algorithm and being a person, acting as a person. As with Latour, Morton is here suggesting that modern people have over-animated human beings and under-animated non-human nature. So he wants us to deflate our understanding of human agency a bit, so as to recognize ourselves as somewhat algorithmic. And he wants us to inflate our understanding of non-human agency, to recognize that non-humans are creative, they're actors, they're involved in giving shape to the nature of reality. Morton writes, Marxism only works if it weirdly embraces animism. So Marx thought that non-human commodities were only treated as agencies because of a kind of human projection or fetishization. But Morton thinks we can find in consumerism the same sort of phenomenological chemicals needed for ecological consciousness. From Morton's perspective, we can retrieve the VIP lounge version of reflexive bohemian consumerism that puts value on experience itself, rather than on material products. So from Morton's point of view, as much as we may try to fight against consumerism, he thinks that there's a trapdoor hidden at the base of consumer capitalism, that if we can get to there, we can drop through into a more ecological relationship to non-humans. Consumerism is how we've come to define ourselves, and advertisers play on this gap within ourselves between our appearance, how we appear to others, and how we feel inside, our what we call our essence. And so we're constantly chasing ourselves, right? And Morton says that this chasing of yourself is something that consumerism relies on. You define yourself via your products. I'm a Mac person. You are what you eat. She is an acid head. Toys R Us. Consumerism contains ecological chemicals, and this is one of them. It's about how consumerism makes spiritual experience into its top access mode. This mode has gradually colonized all the others, so that now we are all experience junkies, just like a handful of avant-garde romantic period poets. We're all about style, not fashion, surfing, not buying a specific thing, window shopping, browsing, scrolling through our timelines. As we style ourselves according to our products and our thingies, something else is happening. We are being styled by them. Without doubt, this is what we are told is disturbing about consumerism. Coca-Cola is controlling your head. We have become mindless pod people. But when you think about it, this is a narrow, distorted version of relating to a non-human being without discriminating as to whether it's alive or dead, sentient or non-sentient, conscious or non-conscious. An aesthetic mode of relating. And it's about allowing that thing to relate to us. Coca-Cola controlling your head is only horrible if you think you are the only form of being that has a head to control. So Morton's not saying let's all embrace a sort of shallow consumerism. He's saying that because consumerism is in a way an example of how non-human objects have agency over us, the way that we desire them is an example, an expression of how objects, which we would normally refer to as insentient, say the iPhone that I'm recording this on, is in fact able to exercise power over me. And that's a profoundly ecological thought, a profoundly relational idea. So it's not that he's trying to apologize for consumerism. He's saying, look more closely at what consumer capitalism is doing, how it works, and the fact that it can work in the way that it does is an example of the symbiotic real at work.